Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Johnston. I am the Director of Data Governance at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm delighted to be able to start our show off today, really talking about institutional readiness for data sharing. I'm going to share a little bit of background of why that might be a good idea for institutions to really think about how we can ensure that our data sharing services meet the desirable characteristics for data repositories for federally funded research. So we'll look at those characteristics. We'll think about why it's important for institutions to be ready to help with data sharing if you aren't already. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the ways that other academic institutions have been providing data repositories, as well as what are the challenges and the barriers to doing this. Okay, so just a really quick overview of the characteristics that we are really focusing in on for this webinar series. In 2022, the Subcommittee on Open Science from the National Science and Technology Council put out this guidance for characteristics that data repositories should have when researchers are looking for a source to place their data. A lot of the funding agencies do actually provide recommendations on some of the subject repositories that they'd recommend researchers deposit their data for long-term sharing, preservation, and reuse. But certainly that doesn't cover everything. And there's actually a lot of different repositories out there. They're popping up all the time. And these guidance were intended to really help researchers be able to assess those potential options and put their data in a home that is a little bit more trusted, perhaps. It kind of reminds me of the Core Trust Seal certification requirements, but maybe in a more self-assessment way. So you can see them here. There are kind of 14 requirements that are for all repositories that fall into those three categories of organizational structure, digital object management, and technology. And then there are an additional 7-ish categories for repositories that are also accepting human subjects data. So it's interesting to think about these requirements to help us really further our goals for supporting data sharing. And I just wanted to show just a use case of how I've seen these characteristics actually utilized, I think, in a really successful way. So the Center for Open Science is one of the generalist repository platforms that did its own self-assessment based on the desirable characteristics document. So in 2022, they released their self-assessment just via a blog post that went through each of those categories and broke down those categories based on what the guidance actually provides, additional information on each of those categories of what researchers should be looking for in an effort, I think, to really help researchers maybe more easily do that kind of evaluation. So I really liked how they broke down the categories in a little bit more friendly way and then assess themselves just, kind of yes or no, do they meet it or have they not met it yet and maybe are working on it. And the reason I thought this was a good example is because a year later, they actually provided an update. So for example, the metadata category. Data sets in their platform must have metadata, and they should also allow researchers to use schemas appropriate to their data community. That was not in 2022 something that OSF was providing, but now in 2023, they announced that they are now providing both of those criteria. So for me, this really showcases the utility of how our community can really utilize this tool and this list of characteristics to create a roadmap for our repository technology and infrastructure, but also our services and the program itself to really aim toward these desirable characteristics and to help us benchmark ourselves amongst the different repositories and all move together toward a better data sharing ecosystem. Okay, so why should institutional repositories care about this? This is something, for maybe just generalist repositories, or something for your subject or domain repositories. But actually, no, I think institutions are already storing and making data available with a lot of different technologies that we have on our campus. So there's a lot of reasons why I think we should be really thinking about this and striving toward it. So one of the first reasons I think is partly just due to our mission, and really how that has positioned academic institutions to really provide optimal data sharing infrastructure for our academic researchers. And that's because we already have our dedicated staff working closely with those researchers throughout the data lifecycle. We have librarians and data curators that are working with them on their data management plans. We've got dedicated IT staff at central or distributed that are working with researchers to select data storage, to secure their data. Research computing staff, other research analysts that are really supporting the analytical phases. And then also we're helping them really think about what data to keep, what data to move into more long-term storage, what data to share. So all of those individuals are already right there to really help support that data sharing process and to think about what might optimally help them in the long term when they want to deposit their data. Another key piece here is our educational mission. We're not only just helping researchers produce data, we're really doing it in an effort to train our graduate students on data management best practices. And a whole aspect, I think, of a part of our program for repository and other research data services is that data training element, really talking about what are the best practices and how can we actually use maybe some of those desirable characteristics to think about translating that into best practice for our students as well. And then finally, our service ethic. We aren't just doing research in a vacuum. We really aim to give back to our community, and our data repositories are a public resource, a public good. So thinking about ways that we could increase access to those resources to make our repositories more transparent and more available to our community is certainly within our mission. The other reason why I think it's really important for institutional repositories to think about these characteristics is because of our perspectives and our expertise that we are bringing to the table. We really care about supporting our data authors in meeting their sharing goals. So we're thinking about, their reputation as an author. Putting out a data set is a bit risky. You really have to think about all the various ways it could be used or misused or misinterpreted. And giving them that support and helping them reach their sharing goals, I think is really a part of our perspective and our expertise. We also care a lot about equitable data access. And this can mean a lot of different things. Certainly, when we talk about repositories, we talk about open access repositories, making publicly accessible data sets. But then there's also certain ways that we can either control or limit access that might not be desirable. So some repositories might put up paywalls or geo walls. You might only be able to access it if you're in a certain country or not in a certain country. And then there's data sharing practices that just ultimately exclude certain people. For example, I linked here this great study by Victoria Stoughton that really just had graduate students reach out to various different data authors and ask for the data via email. And in many cases, they were turned down, and in some cases, they were actually got really negative feedback, because they weren't a peer, perhaps, or it just didn't seem like they were a trusted partner, perhaps. So those kind of more interpersonal barriers to access, I think, is something that we care about too, and we want to be able to overcome. And then finally, as librarians and data curators, we really care about reuse. We work with the people who are trying to find data, who are trying to reuse that data for their own research. So we see those difficulties and we see those problems crop up of maybe this file format is no longer, an available format in a tool that's maybe available in a good price range, or just there isn't enough documentation to really understand the intent or the purpose of the data collection. So we have really seen kind of the full life cycle of that data, and bringing that perspective to the data sharing process is pretty incredible, and I think really helps set the stage for that curation aspect. Finally, if all of those reasons don't resonate with you, I would suggest that the other reason institutional repositories and institutions should really be in this process of providing data sharing services, it's that we also own the data. Many data policies at academic institutions articulate ownership, and they also articulate all the roles and responsibilities in addition to that. You know, definitely the PI is responsible for making decisions about where to share and how to share. But ultimately, it does come down to the institutions owning that data and maintaining that as a resource. So really taking that responsibility and providing your researchers with an institutional home for that data, where it still asserts some of that ownership around the data, could be another facet to consider here. And I think that really greatly lends to the additional training of how we, reach out to our researchers and help them understand their roles and responsibilities if we can clearly articulate the ownership versus the management responsibilities. So again, another link to check out if you don't have a policy for data management at your institution yet. Okay, so there are lots of reasons why we should be doing institutional repository work with data. But what I wanted to share here is just some examples of who is doing it. So the Data Curation Network surveyed 114 ARL institutions in 2020. So this data is a little bit outdated. But we were trying to figure out, which of these maybe larger research-focused academic institutions were providing a data sharing service to their users. And we looked for whether or not they had an institutional repository, whether or not their institutional repository had data in it, and whether they even maybe had a dedicated data repository in addition. So 100% had an institutional repository, which is great. 82% we were able to count or identify data sets that had been deposited there. And even 44% at that time, and I think that number has grown, had a dedicated or a standalone data repository that was providing services for data sharing as well. So you would be in good company, I think, in that. And that makes sense too, because when we think about our research data services in libraries and academic institutions, there's certainly a maturity model that has been recognized. So, as we're starting out with our data services, we're really thinking about, what can we do to help people understand, just the available resources on campus. That might be a website or, just really collecting the various service units that are providing these services, doing an audit of your campus to figure out who's doing what. That might move more toward more formal training in research data management, providing data literacy training and other more advisory type services. And then, eventually providing software and technical solutions for doing the data sharing itself. That comes with cataloging the data, curating the data, preserving it, and then maybe what am I trying to say? Providing the metadata out to the world. And then, of course, there's additional services that might be even more mature than that. So really moving into data analysis and visualization and providing data integrity checks. So this is an example maturity model that really kind of positions data repositories within that broader grouping of services that research data services may include. So you can kind of see that's just a natural kind of element part of what we're doing here. The challenges, of course, and I'm going to wrap up here pretty soon because I know I'm over, is how to maintain these going forward. And when we talk to various different libraries that are providing data services, asking them about their challenges, one of the main challenges is how do I keep my staff up to date on all of the different requirements? How do I train my staff on the various different domain issues that come up with the various different data sets that we're collecting so that we can curate these data and that we can provide, the best quality services for our researchers. So those staffing and training issues continuously pop up. And of course, that's where an area where the Data Curation Network has really focused on, because that's where we heard the need was. So the main things that we've tried to do is really create a platform where you can share expertise when curating data, when looking at data from different domains or different software types, and really understanding, the various people who you might be able to rely on or ask questions or get real help and support in curating that data. And then, of course, we also develop training around curation. So the curated steps, the primers, data curation primers on various different types and formats. And this is all to really help aid in what we heard is kind of the biggest barrier for our academic institutions when going into this area of data sharing services. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker, who I believe is Cowles, who's going to talk to us about what Princeton's been doing with their data sharing.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Let me share my screen. I'll try. Okay, so everyone can just see my slides. And that's good. All right, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to join you all today. My name is Cowles. I'm the Associate Dean for Data Research and Teaching here at Princeton University Library. My division in the library includes our sciences, engineering, and social sciences libraries and services, as well as our research data and open scholarship department, which itself contains maps and GIS, scholarly communications, digital scholarship, and our research data services. So I'm going to talk about our data services program as a kind of case study for building a sustainable data sharing infrastructure, building off of what Lisa just talked about. And preparing for this talk, it really got me thinking about what we've built and how we've gotten to where we are now. So that's kind of the lens I'm going to take. So it made sense to me to kind of take this as a time journey. So we have an origin story. The Princeton Research Data Service, which is our data service, is relatively new. And so I thought it would be helpful to start at the beginning. I think it's been in many ways a real advantage to come into the space a little later than other programs. It gave us the opportunity to talk with others, learn from what others had done and think about how to translate that to Princeton. The origin for the data service really started with a series of conversations between our Dean of Libraries, our Dean for Research, and our CIO. So these are 3 cabinet level positions at Princeton. And they collected input from peers at other institutions, as well as input from academic departments and especially academic chairs on what they were seeing as needs for open data repository support. And based on what they heard, they created a proposal that was then funded by the provost to not just be more infrastructure, but to actually be a whole service. So it included 4 brand new staff lines, as well as some costs for infrastructure. The director started in April of 2019. That was me. That's why I came to Princeton. And I'm in a slightly different role now, but even then I reported directly to the Dean of Libraries, and I had a dashed line relationship to the Dean of Research. And there was kind of by design this intentionality around trying to build in connections between the different units on campus. So that was part of what was happening there. And then we had funding for 2 research data management specialists. They started a few months later, reporting directly to the director, so to me. And then we had a research data storage management engineer. It's a mouthful. So they started a couple months after that. They were based in research computing, which at Princeton, or are based in research computing, which at Princeton is in our campus IT. So the reporting up to the CIO. And then that person had a dashed line reporting relationship to me as the director. And so you can see how we tried, from the beginning to build in these institutional connections. So the formal charge of the service was to provide the research community with expert services and infrastructure for storing, maintaining, retaining, and curating digital research data and making it available to the public. And so we crucially had these kind of 3 campus departments from the beginning. Another thing I'll mention, so Princeton doesn't have any professional schools. We do have a College of Engineering, but we don't have a medical school or a veterinary school or anything like that. So we have a lot of investment and strength in the social sciences, in addition to the sciences. But I would say, you know, what's interesting about us is we also have a lot of digital humanities. And so right from the beginning, we were really charged with serving the whole campus, not just maybe the sciences. We have core services that can be divided into 3 parts. This is probably pretty familiar to many of you. We have consultations, consultation service. You know, we get access to resources and various tools that we then help people use. We have a training and instruction program, and then we have the research data repository services, and that's where I'm going to focus on today. So we manage and host our data repository. We mint DOIs. We have a data curation service. And so that's kind of the service in a nutshell and where it came from. What we're looking at here is a timeline for PRDS, really focused on the top on the progression of events specifically relevant to our open data repository and curation service. So, and again, this is a slightly selective timeline. It's 4 years is a lot, and there's a lot of things happening in those 4 years. But I'll just comment on a couple things above the line. So you can see, you know, the service launches in the spring of 2019. We immediately begin planning. That data commons planning group included folks from all 3 of the major partners. The library took on stewardship and management of data space, which is the data repository, what we use for our data repository until very recently. We minted our first DOI, yay! And then things changed dramatically. For Princeton, the pandemic really started for us in the middle of March of 2020. The data transfer incident, so I created this timeline initially, or an earlier version of it, for some internal meetings. So this refers to, we had a very high profile researcher trying to get a data set into our repository. And in part because everyone was working from home, and in part because we're still trying to figure things out, the data transfer just took a really long, like unacceptably long amount of time before it even got to the curators. And so you can see there's kind of a rapid succession of decisions there. So we have that incident, we have standing up Globus, we have the decision to move to another repository platform, you know, finalizing our decisions, and then, you know, launching our new infrastructure with the idea, with these desirable characteristics in mind. But what I also want to draw attention to are all of the things below the timeline. So these are all of the things that reflect broader activity that really enabled the sustainability of the repository above the line by creating partnerships, identifying shared goals, and really building a whole campus approach to how we think about data services. So just a few things to highlight from that. Everything that's in blue reflects a partnership, either an initiative or a group that we work together, initiative or a project, maybe is a good way of thinking about it. The orange text reflects kind of policy and organizational things that happened over time. And then the black text are things that were really kind of internal to the data service. So includes, you know, joining the DCN, for example. One thing I want to highlight from this actually is, and I think is really illustrative of the point I'd like to make, is that in January of 2020, I had actually written a business case for adopting a campus-wide approach to ORCID. You know, I worked it all out. Here's how, you know, what we would need to build. Here's what the investment would look like. Here's why we should do it. And I got a fair amount of support from my executive sponsors and from we have a faculty advisory committee. Everyone sort of went, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. And then of course, you know, the pandemic happened and all the priorities had to shift. But even without that, it really kind of stalled out until fast forward a couple of years later. And for various reasons that we can talk about, our director of our sponsored research office got really interested in ORCID and Science CV, particularly for NSF funded faculty at Princeton. And so that that project that kind of languished really didn't take off until I had a partner, right? That we could work together and advance that project, which is now starting to be underway. So the approach that we've taken has really and leaned into is this idea that we've got this data repository, we have this data service. What we really have is something that's embedded in a much bigger research data ecosystem on campus. This slide is mostly meant to sort of indicate all the different pieces that are, if they're not directly related to our data repository, they're adjacent in important ways, right? So we have this rich set of services and infrastructure that are related and ideally interconnected, especially if we want to make effective data sharing and long-term stewardship of data sustainable and as easy as possible for our researchers. So what you're looking at here, the darkest orange, discovery, describe, and store, that's the data repository. That we're in the process of rolling out right now, or we've rolled out part of them. We're doing the last bits now. The lighter orange are other library systems that we want to integrate and really have a tight coordination with. But then we also have some external, that's the gray, external to the campus partners. And then we have the light green, which indicate other systems on campus. Everything that's highlighted or ringed in yellow represent partnership projects. So we have this kind of interconnected system. I had tried to draw some lines to connect them all, but it ends up looking like spaghetti. So, every institution is different. I think for us, as we built a kind of coalition of campus partners, here's some groups that really stood out for us. We have, of course, within the library and the Office of the Dean for Research, including our Office of ORPA, Research and Program Administration. That's our sponsored programs office. Research computing, of course. The graduate school is here in part because they have really been essential for helping us with our educational mission. And then we have a number of different research centers that we've partnered with and have really helped us understand at a broader level what the needs are, because that's what they're doing too, right? They're also interested in understanding what the needs of humanists are in the digital space, or what people who are doing really highly intensive data-driven research in the social sciences need. And so partnering with them and talking with them and figuring out what we can do together and what we, so we're not reinventing the wheel. I'll mention too, we hired a university data officer not too long ago, and she's also been an amazing partner as we think through things like data governance. And then of course, key supporters in the provost office, and also, faculty champions. And I think that the key to building these partnerships was really not kind of leading with the repository, but leading with all of these things that could be identified as shared areas of interest or overlapping goals, potentially challenges. And when I think about where our partnerships have been the strongest, they really kind of fall into three broad areas. We've got things that are related broadly to compliance and governance, right? So things like ORCID and persistent identifiers, data management plans, data ethics, and data security. We're working on a research data framework, right? So understanding, what our policies are going to be around research data and how we talk about that, and who's responsible for what. Stewardship is another area. So ensuring the long-term value of research data outputs as a matter of institutional priority, and effectively using university resources. So this is an area, for example, research computing and PRDS have been really great partners together on, because we have shared interests here. And then, of course, our research mission of advancing impactful research, identifying different parts of campus. This is where the research centers also really come into play, where their pain points are, what they are seeing, and what they're interested in, and identifying shared overlapping interests. So it's had its challenges. I would say that there were kind of three areas that we ran across over the last 4 years. There's siloing. I think these are probably not unique to Princeton, right? So there's siloing. We were really fortunate in building the service that there wasn't a sense of territoriality. It wasn't that people were, trying to say this is mine and you can't have it. But we did have kind of the more, I think, regular kind of siloing of people just get used to working on their thing and they don't think about the fact that there's all these other folks on campus who might be interested in the same thing or facing the same challenges. And so really kind of being intentional about reaching out and talking, even in the absence of initially maybe of a clear plan, to say like, what are you facing? What are your interests? What are you trying to advance? And identifying shared goals and related challenges, identifying areas of strength and respecting them, like getting a sense of like, here's what I can do, here's what you can do, here's where we can work together, and sort of slowly building trust. In terms of bandwidth, it's always tricky. We only have so many hours in the day. I think it's been really helpful to find folks who are good at advocating for additional resources and working with them and thinking about what strategically we can ask for. And I think taking an agile and iterative approach, right? So we can't solve everything all at once. We can't build everything all at once. So thinking together and collaboratively about, well, what do we want to do first? And what's our kind of goal? And then, kind of part and parcel with that is managing expectations, right? If we only have a person who does a certain thing, like how do we make sure that they're not burned out? And then last, the speed of change, right? This is something that's really tough. And I don't think it's going to change, right? So ironically, so thinking about working within a environment where new regulations are coming out, new guidance is coming out, new challenges are coming out, really embracing that, or at least accepting it, and building what I think of as reflexive collaboration networks. So having people on campus who will, if some email comes in from some agency, they're like, oh, of course, so-and-so and so-and-so will be interested in hearing about this too. So really thinking of each other and sharing information that way. The other thing that's been really effective for us, especially in the library, has been taking a North Stars approach. So rather than having a really detailed strategic plan, right, with a capital S&P, instead taking a North Star, so sharing like, here are our goals, here's where we want to get to, and then having at each point kind of making decisions that get us to there. Again, not having to solve everything all at once. All right, so that's me. I'll just end with sort of distilling all of that to say, I think for Princeton, developing a sustainable ecosystem for open data has involved kind of at heart situating the data repository within the larger campus system and asking how can it connect to other systems and services on campus, and then identifying key partners and supporters and finding shared goals and interests so that we end up asking each other and ourselves kind of all the time, how can we solve these overlapping problems together? All right, so that's me. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen if I can find the button and pass things over to Cynthia.
Thank you. One moment, please. Excellent. So hello. My name is Cynthia Hudson Vitale, and I'm the Director of Science Policy and Scholarship at the Association of Research Libraries. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to share a little bit about some research we've undertaken at the Association of Research Libraries in collaboration with some of the members of the Data Curation Network. Specifically, I'll be sharing some early results from research we've been conducting on the quality and costs of public access to research data, a project we kind of lovingly call the realities of academic data sharing, or for short, RADS. So there are 6 institutions participating in the RADS initiative. These include Washington University in St. Louis, University of Minnesota, Cornell, Duke, the University of Michigan, and Virginia Tech. As I said, all of these institutions are part of the Data Curation Network. At a high level, the project goal of RADS is to provide kind of an exploratory examination of the activities, services, and infrastructure needed to make research data publicly accessible at each of our institutions. So as part of this, we are also examining, in addition to like the services that are provided at each institution, we are also examining the costs of these services and activities in terms of personnel time and infrastructure. To augment this work, we are also examining the completeness of metadata of research data affiliated with our 6 institutions. Time and money spent to make research data available, such as in institutional repositories, and is also kind of being considered. And this is, as you know, very kind of critical research in that it helps us better understand if data is findable, discoverable, and usable. In other words, we're also studying if the metadata schema at the point or at the location at which the data is shared is being utilized to its fullest potential to create fair data. So I feel like we've covered this a little bit. Lisa did an amazing introduction as to, why this is kind of important. But just to kind of reiterate that, over the last 20 years or so, we've really seen justifications for data sharing kind of come to the forefront in terms of why we make it publicly available. We've heard policymakers and others in this space speak extensively about how if something is publicly funded, the public should have access to it. We know in some instances, data is really expensive to collect. And so by making it available, we can optimize its reuse and we can advance science that much faster. We also know that public data contributes to reproducibility studies. The study by Victoria Stodden that Lisa lifted up in her presentation, I think, really speaks to this. If a graduate student or a postdoc contacts somebody or a faculty member for data and they're not willing to share that's not going to advance science, and that's not going to advance or verify the quality of the research being shared. We also know in the long term, making data available can be considered a gift to future researchers, right? Because it's something to build upon and to act on. In the short term, public data can also mean less duplication of scientific studies. Since it's publicly accessible, it's also discoverable and findable and all those important things. So these are just really a few reasons why making research data is a good idea. Going back to kind of one of the largest drivers of publicly accessible research, though, is through these funder and publisher policies. As many of you on the call know, funder and publishers have really driven a lot of data sharing in the last 20 years. In 2003, the NIH implemented its data sharing policy. And this policy was significant as it was an example to other federal funding agencies and to the White House of why data sharing is impactful. The 2003 policy, as we know, only applied to awards over $500,000. And it applied to final research data only, as well as offered flexibility in terms of where data could be shared. In 2013, about a decade later, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy issued the well-known Holdren memo, which requires agencies with over 100 million in R&D budgets to implement data management and sharing plans. It also specified to the funding agencies 12-month post-publication embargoes were allowed, and that appropriate costs for data management and sharing could be included in proposals. Okay. After this point, we really see funders other than NIH, such as NSF and DOE, implement their data sharing requirements, of course. And so just to be clear, the RAD study really looks at this period of time from 2013 and then really up until the present, which just happens to kind of coincide with the 2022 Nelson memo. So to return to the question, why is RADS important now? We are obviously seeing shifts yet again in the research data management and sharing landscape. 20 years after the original NIH data management and sharing policy, we now have revisions to NIH's policy to include stricter requirements. And also the new policy also applies to all awards generating scientific data. It requires more data to be shared, not just at the publication level, and also encourages the use of established repositories for sharing. NIH is really ahead of its time in terms of policy implementation. As I've mentioned, last summer, the OSTP issued an update on its public access plan requirements, directing federal funding agencies to implement more extensive data sharing policies. At this time, all agencies with R&D budgets are included in the mandate. There are no embargoes to sharing public access versions of publications, and a more comprehensive list of activities are now allowed to be included in the project budget for data management and sharing. By looking at the activities and costs to support public access to research data, the outcomes of RADS, we feel, will really help institutions develop services and infrastructure in response to these new policies, and we hope will inform funding agencies into how institutions are providing infrastructure and what those expenses are. So essentially, we are collecting data to allow institutions, and again, funding agencies to whatever extent they want to engage in this, to make more strategic decisions and investments in public access to research data, infrastructure, services, and staffing. So our study has two investigative streams. The first stream in our study is a metadata analysis of institutional affiliated data sets. Essentially, we wanted to find out where researchers at each of our 6 institutions are sharing their research data, examine the quality of the associated metadata, and assess if the metadata is fair. In our second investigative stream, we surveyed funded researchers and campus administrators to ask about public access data management and sharing activities and costs related to staffing and infrastructure to make these activities happen. And a little bit of an update, our surveys concluded last December, and we recently wrapped up a series of follow-up qualitative interviews with researchers as well as campus service providers, where we gained additional information and context into data sharing practices. Additionally, these interviews were an opportunity for us to ask administrators and researchers about recent changes into data management and sharing practices or their investments, as many folks on campus have been or are working on implementing changes to comply with the NIH policy. So I've mentioned that our survey specifically asked about public access to research data sharing activities. In order to ask about these activities, though, the RADS team first had to determine what those activities were and group them into categories that would make the most sense to both researchers and campus administrators. To accommodate this grouping of activities, this should look somewhat familiar to you. We modified the commonly used research data lifecycle, but then also included a number of common grant lifecycle activities or terms, which ultimately resulted in these 5 phases. So we did do some quality checking through our qualitative interview process if these terms and categories and activities made sense. And so far, the methodology to present the activities and these terms have been clear to both administrators and researchers. I will add these are meant to be kind of iterative too. And I'll show you an example of them in the next slide. We recently also hosted a webinar with RDAP, Research Data Access and Preservation Community, where we got community feedback. And I know a number of our research team members are now reflecting on that feedback and potentially making some changes to the activities based upon that. And I can talk more about that later if folks have questions. So in terms of the activities themselves, here's an example of 4 activities under the data collection, storage, and management phase. Each color represents our different audience, the administrator and the researcher, and uses slightly different language to describe the activity. But the goal is the same, to represent actions that are typical in data sharing. So for example, we know that researchers often develop documentation for their data, but that activity may differ and should differ from an institution's service provider or administrator's review of documentation. So now you've had kind of like a brief introduction to the RADS project. I'm going to pivot just a little bit and share out some high-level outcomes of the research we've completed to date across all institutions, with kind of an overview of where we're headed next. Excuse me. So this is the breakdown of a response rate for our 2 surveys by institution. The administration response rate was around 50%. Each co-PI determined who to send the survey to, but we collaboratively developed a set of inclusion criteria to ensure we reached out to kind of the common offices and administrators on campus that, you know, that institutions typically form around to support cross-campus coordination for research data. So these include the libraries, the research office, IT, and other institutes and centers, such as Sizer at Cornell or I2 at Worcester. And some of the ones are, for example, that Wind also lifted up in her presentation, such as like the Center for Digital Humanities or others. So turning now to the researcher response rate, it was about 7.5%. And I will say the researcher projects were collected by leveraging the NIH, NSF, and DOE grant award databases for projects that matched our 5 disciplinary areas. We did remove any researchers who no longer worked at the institution, and emails were sent automatically through like our survey software platform. So this is just kind of a visualization or one of the visualizations of data management and sharing activities that were found across our the 6 institutions just within the research office. So you see there's a lot of support in the pre-award phase or the planning, design, and startup of the project phase of the work. Some institutions, such as Michigan, also provide support in the phase of making data broadly available, advising researchers on licensing and hosting research data. Thank you, Sarah. I will say that this visualization was Lisa Johnson's idea, so she gets all the credit there. So by comparison, this visualization shows services and support aggregated among university libraries. It visualizes a significant amount of activity in the making data broadly available phase and data retention, including preservation, archive, and long-term access phase of the research and grant lifecycle. And I think what's interesting, and Wynn touched on this a little bit too, is that you may observe that there's some overlap between services provided by the research office and the libraries at some of our institutions. Michigan kind of stands out if you looked closely at that. And I think one of the benefits of conducting this research and developing these maps is the identification of areas to increase efficiencies at the institutional level. I will add that through our qualitative interview process, it has been really helpful in kind of digging down into this service area a little bit more for the overlapping areas, because what we're finding is that there's still distinct service points, even though at a broad level, there may be some overlap. So next, while we are still analyzing and cleaning our data from the retrospective researcher surveys, we have conducted a quick analysis and comparison of the activities that researchers stated were done by the lab or by PI, and those done with institutional assistance. So not surprisingly, 90% of researchers indicated they made the decisions about what data to share or host. 81% were responsible for ensuring public access requirements were met, et cetera. On the other hand, researchers primarily leveraged institutional support for developing DUAs or data use requirements, compiling reports, ensuring data security, and evaluating data security needs. Interestingly, most of these institutional activities have been mapped to campus-based IT, research office, and library activities. So those typical folks you would see in some kind of cross-campus coordination. Yeah, Megan, the security one is noteworthy. I would love to have, when we get to the discussion point, talk more about that. So digging into the cost of research data sharing, we asked researchers to approximate how much staffing and the approximate staffing expenses for public access to research data activities. Across all institutions, the average salary per grant, and I should say this always came out to be a percentage of a person or person's time, was around $22,000 a year, with some total salary expenses. This is multiple people, multiple percent effort, at around $250K. And you can see on that left-hand slice, the standard deviation was 40, and it ranged again from 0 all the way up to 260. So there's a lot of variability here. In the qualitative follow-up interviews, we did try to get some more clear numbers around that too. And so that we're in the process now of going back and refining what we found. So as I said, in addition to salaries, we're also curious about infrastructure expenses. And the answer options for this question were presented as ranges. As you can see in this graph, the most frequent range of infrastructure expenses was between $1 and $499,000. There were some significant outliers in this data, with some reported infrastructure expenses as high as $2 million. So, which may not be surprising, since this also included large funders such as NIH. So as I said, we've just finished up a series of interviews and focus groups with both the campus-based administrators and researchers who completed the surveys. Again, this process had many goals, such as verifying the shared understanding of the terms, verifying the expense information was accurate and comprehensive, and specifically for researchers, determining if and how the data sharing process and workflow has changed their practices. The NIH DMS was developed to facilitate culture change, and we are really, really curious to learn if across funding agency recipients as well, if we're seeing this happen, or if it's mostly still just, like a compliance mechanism. So that's kind of the general early outcomes of the research for RADS. We will be publishing a fuller report probably in early September or this fall, once we get things in line. Here are some references for you, and I'm happy to pop. We just did a blog post update on some of our outcomes, and I'll be sure to share that as well. I thought I would just take a few minutes as we transition into over into the discussion section. I think, it's been really great to hear presentations by Lisa and Wynn today. Some of the key themes, right? This institutional responsibility and mission that we have within libraries is kind of critical is critical to upholding many of these policies that are in place, either from funding agencies or from publishers. And I think and within our own institutions, as that's sort of developing more and more. And so that's like a key theme that I heard, and important to kind of keep having conversations around. Also, cross-campus coordination is key. No one department or organization owns this, as we know. So continuing and building and cultivating those relationships is critical. Also, this came up in another kind of thing we did at ARL, like formalizing those organizations or those kind of groups is also super, super important. I think all too often these relationships are built on the personal level, and sometimes when somebody leaves, that relationship and that group kind of dissipates, like it goes away. And so the more we can have kind of formal action and formation and charges of these groups, I think the overall, the more effective and efficient they will be. Scaling services was also brought up from Lisa in her presentation, and just how to maintain services through an ever-growing number of requirements. And I think that that's really important, especially as we think about going forward, all of these different, potentially different public access plan requirements that are going to come from each federal funding agency. Like it could be potentially complex. I know that there's some work being done in the subcommittee in open science to do some harmonization. But it's also different research types and different funding mechanisms. So there's going to be variability. And so navigating that and thinking about services to support that is going to be kind of like a key challenge or something we have to address going forward. Wind talked a lot about sustainability, and I think that that's just something that's on all of our minds, I will say. And it kind of goes back to the cross-campus coordination as well. So how do we kind of maintain those relationships so that moving forward, and even in like this kind of, unknown future of public access plans, like how we can be effective and efficient. And then finally, kind of from the RADS work, strategic investments. So expenses for public access to research data are incurred by both the institution and the researchers. Getting a handle on these costs will be important for sustainability and increased demand going forward.